Today we are going to showcase Penitent, which is the most recent book in the Sylvia Wilcox series. Now, over time, you may have noticed I've added some books on the front end, some prequels. So the numbering has kind of changed a little bit for the series, but Penitent is the most recent book. And today I'm going to do a short reading. I'm going to read the first chapter just to give you an idea about what the book is about. If you've been following along with the series, then you know that in Road to Nowhere, there was a case mentioned, a missing person case of a priest in Wyoming. And it's something that Sylvia mentions in passing because she's out in Wyoming on another case, the main case in Road to Nowhere. So, but it's something that her friend, Father Keegan, back in Michigan, mentioned to her because he was once in Wyoming early on in his priesthood. So that's what is going on here. The detective in Wyoming, Chris Ruiz, that she worked with in Road to Nowhere, is back in this book. So here is the first chapter.
He's buried in the Red Desert. He's in India, ran away from the priesthood and started a new life. I heard that he was dumped in an old mine in northern Wyoming. No reason why he was killed. Nice guy. Took the kids fishing and hunting. Most of us weren't into his religious stuff, but having a beer with him was always nice. A real cowboy dreaming man. He'd grown up in a city, but he seemed to really love being here. Please don't go back up there. Lucinda, Christopher Ruiz's wife, was the final line that echoed in his head, but the previous three statements had encouraged him to take another trip to the mountains. Now, he wasn't sure he'd get to hear his wife's sweet voice again. As he desperately searched for something solid to hold on to, he wished he'd listened to her. Ruiz was scrambling along a narrow ledge that towered 10,000 feet above the valley. He'd only looked down once, a decision he regretted. Loose shale rock dislodged and slid along the edge of the mountain. Ruiz grabbed hold of the side of a boulder, pulled himself up, and located another rock large enough to serve as a step. You'll either make it or you won't. It was a line he'd found soothing during his 15-year career in law enforcement. Whenever he was in danger, he'd think you'll either make it or you won't. The somber thought calmed his nerves and gave him the strength and courage to push through. After all, if he didn't make it, he'd only be aware of his failure for a few moments. If he fell off the side of the mountain, the descent would be fatal. He imagined that on his way down, as he hurtled through time and space, he'd hear his wife's voice again. Only this time she'd be saying, "I told you not to go back up there." It was an unseasonably warm day in early spring. The trails were empty and would remain so for the next few months. Late April was a bad time to head out to higher elevations because of the unpredictability of the weather, but Ruiz had learned from his father that spring was the best time to go if you wanted solitude, which was what he desired. Searching for the remains of a man who went missing decades before required focus. The oscillating weather, spring runoff, and emergence of animals made searches dangerous. 1 minute sunshine was warming your face, and the next, a blanket of snow would rapidly cover the mountain. With this in mind, Ruiz was doing his best to examine the area one more time before accepting that Jim Raskin wasn't in the mountains. He'd gone through all the cabins, which were full of graffiti and trash from vagrants, and searched the nearby ravines. If he died from exposure, the snowmelt would have taken the bones down to the bottom of the mountain, so Ruiz walked awash and checked caves in the area. He'd even checked the land where an orphanage run by the church had stood. The priest, Father Arturo, had sighed when Ruiz walked into his office. "How can I help you, officer?" The priest asked after Ruiz introduced himself. "I'm investigating a missing person case and would like to check the area around the old orphanage." "Oh no, who's missing?" Father Arturo's eyes caught fire. He stumbled out of his chair, gripping the edge of his desk as he stood up. "It's an old case, Father." The old man let out a long, labored sigh. Ruiz had heard the priest drive 100 miles every Saturday and Sunday to cover the small parishes in the area. It seemed like a lot of work for an elderly man. "Oh, how old?" "Early 1980s. "Oh, I see." Father Arturo sat back down. He seemed relieved to know it wasn't one of his current flock, but Ruiz wondered why he wasn't more concerned. A soul is a soul. Even if the person had been missing for decades, it was still important to locate them, even if they were deceased. It was a priest, Ruiz said. Father Jim Raskin. I suppose that doesn't surprise me too much. Dangerous country around here. Easy to underestimate it. By all means, search, but I can't be there with you. I'll be driving to Riverton in the morning and won't be back until the evening. But Bishop Lancaster has granted you permission to check the area. He told me to make sure you were safe. You won't be going by yourself, will you? I haven't been up there, but I've heard that it's treacherous. I will try to get some colleagues to travel with me, Father. Ruiz lied. Good. We want Father Jim found and returned to his family, but nothing is worth your life, so please promise me you won't go there by yourself. Ruiz felt a thin line of sweat form on the back of his neck. He hated lying to anyone, especially a man of the cloth, but there was no way anyone was going to entertain his crazy idea. The only person who would indulge him was across the country, oblivious to his mission. Father, if you could just pray for me, I'd really appreciate it. Yes, of course. I'll pray for you and your companions. What are their names? Sylvia Wilcox will accompany me, Ruiz said, surprising himself. He hadn't spoken to Sylvia in a few years. As far as he knew, she was back in Michigan living her life. She didn't know he was searching for Father Raskin, but since Sylvia Wilcox was the person who'd sparked the hunt for the priest, her name was on the tip of his tongue. Only one? Is this Sylvia Wilcox also a detective? Ruiz hesitated. Yes, she is a detective of sorts. The priest gave Ruiz a skeptical look, but his tired eyes showed he was stretched too thin to lecture Ruiz on honesty. Very well. Christopher Ruiz and Sylvia Wilcox. Be safe, the priest said as Ruiz left the rectory. Now he was dangling over the silent wilderness and wishing the priest had pushed back more. Would he have postponed the search if Father Arturo had pressed him a little more on the details? Probably not, but he felt better shifting some of the blame. Ruiz hadn't been sure he was in good enough shape to do this hike, but he decided, against his wife's wishes, to do it. Anyway, the mountains had been his playground when he was a teenager, but after several years in the southern part of the state, living in a city, Ruiz knew he'd lost a step or two. Still, he was determined to give it a try. If the craggy peaks proved to be insurmountable, I'll turn back, he told himself as he headed to the cliff. But now he had to keep going. He was at the point of no return. It would have been smart to take someone with him, but for now he wanted to work the hunch on his own. This was his third time on the mountain, and Ruiz was confident he would find what he was looking for. The first time he'd made it a quarter of the way to the trail and turned back. Several weeks after that, he tried again and only made it halfway. Then winter hit. He'd used the time to get back into running and lifting weights. Now he was in much better shape, but the hike was still verging on insurmountable. Ruiz closed his eyes for a moment and thought of his dad. Give me strength, Papa, he muttered. His father, a former sheepherder, had spent weeks traversing the isolated edges of the mountains. Most people skip it. They don't think nature on its own is beautiful, but that's a mistake, his father told him. We would always go by there because it was peaceful. There were rumors some Catholic priests from Europe put the cross there. They wanted to create a spot for Catholicism in a place that isn't very Catholic. They wanted to leave something behind in Wyoming, so they made a place of pilgrimage in an area people don't travel often. Long ago, it was a campsite owned by the church. Now it's privately owned, so you have to scramble to it if you want a day hike, but the safer way is to split it into 2 days, especially in the springtime. It's hard to get there, and you need permission from the owner. For some time, there was a stream that gushed in the late spring with the snow melt, but last I heard it was dry. Of all the places to hike, it is not remarkable, but when you get there, it's calm. Ruiz had taken the shortcut, which turned out to be a mistake because the snowfall from the previous winter was beginning to rush down the side of the mountain. He was soaked and shivering and saying a prayer in his head as he gathered his strength. Technically, he was on vacation. He felt guilty for working when he should be spending time with his family, but something about this case kept him up at night. As he ran his hand over the ledge above, Ruiz asked for help aloud. Please let me be right about this, he said. Finding a rock, he grasped it with both hands and hoped he was strong enough to hoist himself up. Ruiz felt his arms shake, noting that if they failed him, he'd tumble down the cliff face. His body would hit jagged rocks and possibly get banged into pieces before he made it to the bottom, where whatever was left of him would spatter against the valley floor. You've got one shot at this, he told himself before closing his eyes and concentrating. Ruiz focused all his energy on his arms and forced his body to the next level, using the side of the cliff as a stepping stone before lifting himself up to a rocky ledge. Scrub brush and scatterings of burned tree trunks lined the cliff. The area had been partially scorched at some point, leaving the scenery opaque and uninviting. It wasn't as picturesque as the surrounding mountains, so it would be a good place for a body to be hidden out of sight. The ground was hard and dry and filled with small rocks. Ruiz headed towards a dip in the land, being led by the words of his father. There was a small stream that created a waterfall over the side of the mountain. He knew he was close. His father told him that the sheep would head to the area because there wasn't a lot of water on the mountain. I remember coming around the corner of the ledge, lifting myself up, and walking towards a small cave. There was a cross near the cave, and if I wanted to make a statement about how much I hated religion, Catholicism in particular, but I also didn't want to get caught, I'd go to that site. The message would be for the victim, not the world. His father told him, "You're assuming there is a message behind the disappearance. A man calls and asks a priest to meet him for confession. The priest is never seen again. It's definitely about religion." Maybe. No, it's definitely about religion. Before the conversation with his dad, Ruiz had been following other theories, but he'd learned that his father, who was both wise and a bit of a mystic, should never be ignored. The thing that happened first is the thing that matters most, his father said. Initially, Ruiz didn't know what he meant, but now that he was standing on the ledge, he understood the meaning behind his father's words. The thing that happened first. The call mattered the most. Ruiz let out a loud sigh of relief when he saw the cross. It was rusted, but still standing. He got on his knees and started gently digging. After an hour of examining the cliff, he spotted the gleam of something white poking through the soil. Ruiz used a small rake to search the area near the object. It didn't take long for him to realize he was looking at Jim Raskin's skull.